Good evening. I'm Kimberly Johnson, the Chief Executive Officer at the Tulsa City County Library. I'm so pleased that you can join us virtually for this special program to close our series, TCCL Remembers. Over the last year, our library has developed programming to honor all who have been impacted by the Tulsa Race Massacre, while also exploring its lingering impact. We are engaging our community around the challenges, past and present, including racial and cultural divisions, as well as finding ways to foster hope and healing through meaningful conversations. The conversation continues tonight with author Clifton Taulbert. As part of this series, TCCL has developed a specially curated exhibit highlighting the Black Wall Street and the events of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. This exhibit is currently open at Rudersville Regional Library. While you are there, visit the African American Resource Center that opened nearly 23 years ago to highlight the history and culture of the African American experience. At TCCL, we have made it a priority to bring awareness of race relations throughout our communities, and we have been intentional about offering opportunities to support the community's education and understanding. Tonight's conversation and all the programs in the series, TCCL Remembers, wouldn't be possible without our dedicated partners. I would like to thank the Tulsa City County Library Commission, the Tulsa Library Trust, the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, WPX Energy, the African American Resource Center, the Friends of the Tulsa City County Library, and Fulton Street Books and Coffee. This evening, we are pleased to have Clifton Taulbert join us as we focus on healing. Clifton Taulbert is the president and CEO of Fremont Corporation. He is also a member of the Tulsa Library Trust. He has written 14 books, produced a major motion picture, and served as a consultant on several documentaries. Joining Mr. Taulbert to facilitate the discussion is the Tulsa City County Library's Manager of Adult Services, Rebecca Harrison. Please welcome them both.
Thank you, Kim. Good evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Harrison, and I'm the Manager of Adult Services at Tulsa City County Library. I am so honored to introduce Clifton Taulbert and to be a part of this closing event for our TCCL Remembers program. Having attended past events in this series, it's been so gratifying to witness these important community conversations about the Race Massacre. Throughout the evening, please feel free to submit your questions for Mr. Taulbert using Zoom's Q&A feature. He will respond to a handful of audience questions following his presentation. Before we begin, I would like to thank Tulsa City County Library's CEO, Kimberly Johnson, the Tulsa Library Commission, the Tulsa Library Trust, and the other wonderful partners Kim mentioned for making tonight's program possible. And now to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. According to Clifton Taulbert, noted author and entrepreneur businessman, he could have failed had he not encountered community builders and entrepreneurial thinkers early on in his life. Taulbert was born in the Mississippi Delta during the era of legal segregation, where he completed his secondary education. Though opportunities were few and barriers were plentiful, Taulbert managed to dream of being successful, not yet knowing the shape that success would take. Taulbert is also an international lecturer and a Pulitzer Prize nominated author of many books, including the award-winning Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored, which became a major motion picture. Today, Taulbert is the president and CEO of the Fremont Corporation, a human capital development company serving clients nationally and internationally, including Fortune 500 companies, small businesses, federal agencies, professional organizations, community colleges, and K-12 leadership. Additionally, Taulbert is the president and CEO of Roots Java Coffee, an African-American owned national coffee supply company sourcing beans from the country of Rwanda. Please join me in warmly welcoming Clifton Taulbert.
Ms. Harrison, thank you. Mrs. Johnson, thank you as well. Over the past few months, we have traveled back in time through music, the spoken word, dramatic productions, dancers, and lawyers, all lending their voices to history to be taught and lessons to be learned. This is an amazing time in Oklahoma and in Tulsa and in our country as we look for ways to further and clearly understand who we are and what we can accomplish. As I get some help with moving let's see here. Sometimes technology does not do exactly what you want it to do, and you realize just how important your neighbor is, how important the friend is. And so for me, the tech guy that sits next to me, that's why he's here. But opening the doors of history, that's my greatest joy as a writer. Looking through the rubbish of life, because there is rubbish in life, to discover our best steps forward. I have looked at 3 books that I have written, Once Upon a Time When We Were Colored. I wrote that book at a time during the Vietnam War. I was in the military at the time. And in spite of all the challenges that we faced during the Jim Crow laws, that era, and legal segregation that was a way of life, I also encountered incredible, ordinary people who became extraordinary leaders. So the book really became a thank you book to the people who put their best steps forward for me at a very crucial time in my life. So Once Upon a Time is not just about the Jim Crow era, but it is about the era of community when friendship mattered and friendship had not lost its way. And then you fast forward to 50 years later, I write a book called The Invitation. And The Invitation was an opportunity for me, if you will, for 5 years to look in the rearview mirror of my life. Because coming to Allendale, South Carolina, I had an opportunity for an invitation to dinner, supper as it was called. And that particular invitation would introduce me to an older Caucasian lady, pretty close to 90 years of age. And I had assumed her to be a retired school teacher. But I later would find out while on my way to her home that she was a descendant of one of the large slaveholding plantations in South Carolina and was actually running the plantation herself. Even then, thousands of acres of cotton. And when our car pulled up on her premises and I saw the mansion in which she lived and the cotton that surrounded it, I said to myself, I can't do this. I really wanted to stay in the car. But I knocked on the door with others, and Mrs. Camille Cunningham Sharp came to the door, and she immediately grabbed my arms and she said these words, Mr. Taulbert, we have been waiting for you. And I would learn over the 5 years that our paths crossed, I was able to overlook some of the rubbish and to find some gems that were there, hiding between the pieces of rubbish. Because for those 5 years, this granddaughter of slave owners would make a path into her life for me and for others that could not have happened when I was a child. But over the course of those years and months, my path traveled a different way because someone decided to live beyond the challenges of yesterday and to create a day that was entirely unlike any day I could have imagined when growing up on the Mississippi Delta. And then I had the opportunity to write 8 Habits of the Heart, because this becomes the action book. How do we move forward? How do we discover our better selves? In the 8 Habits of the Heart, it gives you stories of ordinary people who became extraordinary leaders, taking nurturing attitude and making it a real part of one's life, taking courage and hope and making it come alive in my presence as a young kid. And I firmly understand and know that my life was changed and transformed, not because of the challenges of legal segregation or the Jim Crow laws that were forever present and the cotton that was still king when I was a child. It was because I encountered people who moved their best steps forward on my behalf. So looking back through time, what happens when friendship loses its way? Envy appears, fear, wars, whether it's World War I, World War II, whether it's Vietnam, Cambodia, Afghanistan, war, death, greed, genocide, Rwanda, chaos, and sometimes massacres in 1921 will mark our day. This is what happens when friendship loses its way. So I'm thinking about this as I listen to the words of Marvin Gaye. What's going on? What was really happening in the world in 1971? 1970, 1967, 1968, the assassinations of Dr. King, Robert Kennedy, racial unrest, all of these things were going on. And then there was the Vietnam War on top of all of that. So what's going on? That's the question that was asked through this incredible song that has become somewhat of an anthem today as we listen to his words, probing deeply into our hearts and mind, asking us to take a look at the world around us. Take a look at history as we've been doing through the library system for the last few months and ask ourselves this question, what's going on? What can we do? What have we done? What should we be doing? Because Marvin Gaye said, after asking all of those questions, he said, only love can conquer hate. And this reminds me of the importance of friendship, because friendship evolves into the love and relationships that last for lifetime. How do we bring it back? How do we make it a part of our lives? These are decisions that only we can make, but we have the capacity to make those decisions. So in 1921, what's going on? What's going on in Tulsa, Oklahoma? What's going on in a place called Deep Greenwood, which will later be known as Black Wall Street of America? Well, first of all, what was going on? I would say this, that community was on display. You have Luella and John Williams and their son in their car. I love that picture because what it does, it shows us a family. This was May 29th, 1921. This was one day, just 24 hours before their world would change. This was their world. This is Mount Zion Baptist Church, preparing for another Sunday, preparing for a time to worship, where you go from a cowshed to an edifice that reminds you of a small cathedral. And then there's this lady on Greenwood who's well-dressed for the day, well-dressed for the evening, well-dressed for Sunday. So what's going on? Community is on display. Friendship is alive and well. The Williams Dreamland Theater is open. 700 to 1,000 people can file in and find a seat to watch the latest movie. And then there's Mr. Simon Berry. I love the story of this man who was a mechanic, taught at colleges from Mississippi to Tennessee, but he ended up finding his way to Oklahoma, to a place called Tulsa. And he ended up becoming a major participant in the growth of Black Wall Street. Simon Berry owned an airplane or two. And this was a guy who had learned to fly. And why is this important? Because 1865 was the last days of enslavement, and over 5 million people were given the permission, allowed to really be themselves, to discover who they are and who they could become and what they could make. I've often wondered if I had been incarcerated emotionally, or my parents had been incarcerated emotionally and psychologically for 246 years, what would I do when I first became free of that enslavement, those chains? Would I head out to build a town? Or would I go in hiding? Or would I try and find the latest psychologist to determine what had happened to my mental sense of self? No, these people set out to discover who they could become and what they could create. And what we're looking at, these pictures of the Williams Dreamland Theater. We're looking at Simon Berry's airplane, looking at Man's Meat Market. We're looking at the Greenwood Booster Club. These were men on May 29th This is what they were thinking about. How will my tomorrow look? How will May 31st look? How will June 1st look? This is what they're thinking about because this is their world this day. Community and friendship, is on display. And we have a chance to see the world as they viewed it on those days before the world changed for them. And when the world changes, it can be almost akin to death. When what you had one day is forever gone and your life has to start all over again. When friendship loses its way, it can literally change our lives and change our world. 24 hours later, just 24 hours later, friendship would literally lose its way and the flames would roar. The heat would be there. The earth will be scorched. And Mount Zion Baptist Church, where worshipers would come on Sunday to give and pay homage to the God of their faith, to the friends that they sit beside, the families that they love. Now the flames are just ensconcing it and just taking it out of reality and to another way of life. And then there's the Dreamland Theater. It's no longer standing tall and proud. A theater built by Lulu Williams and her husband, John. An incredible place that could seat hundreds of people. Now it's gone. The flames have taken it. Friendship is not as simple as it seems. Friendship can build bridges between people that will literally last a lifetime. When friendship is present, our ethnicity does not matter. What matters is our humanity. When friendship is present, we seek to save, not to destroy. When friendship is present, we seek a fire to warm us, to cook our food, but not to destroy a world that these men and women have built. And just to think, they had built this world. It was only 35 years after the ending days of enslavement. And all of a sudden, you're starting a life that puts you and casts you in a light of success, having done something that is absolutely marvelous and wonderful. 1969, then and now. The singers, they would come and they would sing this song. He ain't heavy. He ain't heavy. And then we would get this picture. No, he isn't heavy because he's my brother. Of all the pictures that lay out the life of Black Wall Street, the destruction of this incredible place, this picture of a brother holding his brother who's now deceased. And he sings a song. He ain't heavy. He's my brother. Wow. Friendship destroyed when friendship loses its way. A brother does not have the other brother anymore because life has changed drastically. 1921 remembered is a call to action in 2021. Friendship mattered then, and friendship matters now. We're asking ourselves the question, what is the call to action? What can we do? Where do we go from here? Now that we have traveled back to 1906, when Greenwood was incorporated and stretched out as a place to call their own. We traveled that far back, over 100 years. We look at the people, we look at the place, we find ourselves being carried away in with the destruction that is so real, that is not 100 years ago. It feels as if it has just happened today, that the fire is still burning, the screams can still be heard, and little boys can say, he's not heavy because he's my brother. Friendship matters, but when friendship loses its way, so many other things can happen. And it's up to us. We are the people. We are the human factor that gives life to friendship and we can take the life of friendship away. What's going on? The words of Marvin Gaye are haunting because they're not just asking the question, but they're asking us to dig deeply within our souls, within our intellectual capacity, within our hearts, within our minds, to really try and understand, why did this happen in 1921? Why did the Vietnam War happen? Because all of these things, why did Kennedy get assassinated? Why did Dr. King get assassinated? Why are we losing so many of our brothers and sisters? All of these things that are going on. But where do we go from here? There has to always be a path to lead us to a different place, a better place, so we can somehow understand what is really going on and where do we go from here. Building for the future. One, reflecting friendship. This is what we have to do. We owe it to the generations not yet born. We owe it to the generation that is still crawling, reaching for their mom and dad, wanting to hold hands with their sister and their brother. We need it for the generation who just entered the first grade, have no idea what life will offer them and what they can offer life. We need to ensure the presence of friendship, because it is the friendship that we build that gives us the reason to clearly understand who we are as humans and what we can accomplish when we link our hearts and minds together and build for the future. I came into the world in 1945. I was born during the season when Jim Crow was the law of the land. Legal segregation was a way of life, and cotton was still king. As a baby, I had no idea that the color of my skin would make decisions for me that I would not be able to make for myself, because I am just here on the planet, loved by my parents, loved by my great-grandparents, and loved by my great aunt who would eventually raise me. I was born during that season, but also during that season, I would encounter ordinary people who became extraordinary leaders as they built community by embracing and becoming these powerful habits of the heart. When the habits of the heart are broken, when the habits of the heart are trodden under our feet, when the habits of the heart are disregarded, when the habits of the heart are not understood to be as powerful as they are, that's when friendship loses its way. That's when friendship decides to just become part of a destructive source, a destructive force. That is when we have the story of 1921. That is when we have the ravages of life in a way that we had not seen before. But what happened when we encounter ordinary people who become extraordinary leaders? This is who we can become in the 21st century. These are the people that I met as a kid. These are my great-grandparents, Joe and Pearl Young. Even though legal segregation and the Jim Crow laws would define their lives, they built a world for me beyond that. And that is why I wrote the book, 8 Habits of the Heart, because I wanted to tell the story of strength and resiliency of a family of people who lived in love in spite of how they were treated, in spite of how they were dismissed and overlooked. But yet they built a world that said, Clifton, tomorrow will be your day, and we're going to prepare you for that day. This is what ordinary people do when they love and when they're driven by unselfish hearts. They make a difference in the world in which they live. Unselfish people become school teachers. And I remember the first day I was taken to school by my great-grandmother. I didn't really want to go, but I remember exactly today as if I'm still standing in the front door of the Glen Allen Colored School, as it was called in those days. And there stands my teacher, Miss Mary Maxey. And my great grandmother says to her, Miss Mary, this is my boy. I want you to make something out of him. And I remember what she said. She said, little professor, we have a seat for you. And to say little professor in a school surrounded by cotton fields where tractors are humming, the maids are on their way to work, and the butlers are headed there, and the gardeners are headed to work, and the fields are filled with people. She said to this 6-year-old boy, little professor, we have a seat for you. This is what happens when friendship has not lost its way. And then there's my mother, this incredible lady who's one of the founders of Head Start in the Mississippi Delta, who has spent part of her life as a maid, making 10 or 12 bucks a week, but was totally determined that her children would get an education. And when we were all in school and I was in the military, my mother was challenged to go back to school herself. And there were friends, a guy named Jake Ayers and a lady named Mrs. Ann Britton. The two of them just wrapped their lives around my mother and encouraged her to stretch out. And in spite of everything that was going wrong, they was telling her everything that was going right. You can go back to school. You can do this. And she did, to the University of Alabama, and became an A student. And as I said earlier, one of the founders of Head Start in the Mississippi Delta and the director of Yates Center. This is what happens when friendship has not lost its way. We get a chance to discover who we are. It is the friendship of the newly freed enslaved, where they find themselves in Indian territory. They find themselves in a place where land is free. They find themselves where they own almost 3.5 million acres of land, because many of these people were part of the 5,000 Black people that walked the Trail of Tears in 1832, finding themselves in Indian territory. But they will all become part of the story of Black Wall Street. They would become friends. They would become established relationships that would forever change their lives and what we would expect of them, and hopefully what we would expect of ourselves. And this is the lady for whom I work at a time when working in and around white families, the rules of engagement had been determined by legal segregation. The rules of engagement had been determined by the laws of Jim Crow. But this lady decided to ignore those. And I remember the first day that I went to work for her. And all of a sudden around 11:30, you get hungry. I was raking fig leaves and she comes out of a sewing shop and she said, Clifton, come on, let us go and eat lunch. And I hear a word, a pronoun that is relatively new to me. Let us go and eat lunch. And that moment of time, she's breaking the laws of legal segregation. She's breaking the Jim Crow laws. I'm not going through the back door. I'm going through the front door. This is what friendship does. Friendship creates a pathway that defines your humanity as equal to all. And this is why we had 1921, because the friendship that had happened between those who had become free, those who had walked out of enslavement into a freedom of their own, to create something that had not been, to establish themselves in ways that had not been established before. These were incredible stories of an incredible people who were destined and determined to make their own field of dreams. And they brought their friendship together to make it happen. But when the friendship of others would lose its way, we would see mayhem and destruction in ways that we have never seen before. Friendship mattered then, and friendship matters now. And there's my great aunt, a lady who clearly understood the role that she would play in my life. She was a domestic migrant field worker, but I remember while working the fields of the Delta, that she was thinking about the future of her son. In her little brown coffee jar, she would raise money in the fields while we were picking cotton to send to her son. The future mattered. When friendship is a real part of our lives, we don't just think about the today, but we think about tomorrow as well. Friendship empowers the futuristic attitude that can give us the will to do the things that we need to do in order to become the people that we can become. So this is what my great aunt would do. She would make sure that she was doing her part for her own son, and likewise for me as well. For 4 years, I would travel 100 miles round trip to school because of Jim Crow and legal segregation. And even though that was something that was a disastrous part of our world, but what I remember most is my great aunt who stood on the front porch every morning before I did. And she would turn on, not turn it on, but she would pull the string on the 60-watt light bulb so that the bus driver would know that I was going to school that day. I never missed a day. She never missed a day. And for those 4 years, I never missed a day out of school. What am I really saying? Is that the same spirit that built Black Wall Street is the same spirit of friendship that allowed people in the Mississippi Delta during the tragic days of Jim Crow and legal segregation to have another highway that they would travel, one that they would put their children upon and say, your future means more to me than my own life does. It's incredible. It's incredible as I think about this, and to think about 1921 on May 29th, when everything was well. There were no problems. People were filled with pride, filled with happiness, surrounded by the success they had brought into their own world. It was absolutely an incredible place because friendship was laced through all of these relationships. And when friendship is there, you build relationships that can last a lifetime, and you build bridges from one to another. It was an incredible time in their lives. And what about the old African who lived in his shotgun house, a field worker, but at the same time, a man ahead of his times, a voracious reader, collecting books where he worked, collecting old magazines. His front room of his house were filled with books and magazines, but at the same time, he was an unselfish person. So on those Saturdays, when the day off for many people, he would walk into Glen Allen where we live with his satchel filled with books. He was a stutterer. And by the time he would walk those 12 miles into Glen Allen, he would stop at my grandpa's house and in stuttering voice say, Eddie Young, I need some water bad. And my grandfather would get him a dipper filled with water and he would gulp it down rather quickly. But then the magic would start. The same type of magic that caused these incredible men and women of Black Wall Street to build hotels, to build movie theaters, to become incredible medical physicians, to become incredible teachers and principals. That same type of environment, this man that we call the old African, this stuttering old man, would take his books out of the satchel, and in his stuttering voice, he would begin to read. And in the reading, he would take us to places we had never been, the things we had never seen, because his expectations for us, it was that our future would be better than theirs. And as Emily Dickinson said, there is no frigate like a book. And he understood that what he couldn't give us with his life, he would give us through the books that he would read and the stories that he would tell, enlightening our minds and hearts that there was another place beyond the Mississippi Delta, beyond Jim Crow, beyond legal segregation, and he wanted us to be prepared for that place. And that, to me, is one of the hallmarks of Black Wall Street. Just 35 years out of enslavement, they're telling themselves by 1900, wow, this is who we are. We have come to make our mark, to stake our claim, to let the world know that we are not slaves, but we are free men and women on our way to an incredible place of our own. And they set out to do just that. And then there's Reverend Roy Grisham, the uncle of the incredible Southern writer, John Grisham. But this is a man who, in the time of the integration of Ole Miss, put his life and profession on the line for the Black students who were there. And how I know this, because my sister was among the first of the students after James Meredith to integrate Ole Miss, jailed for having done so. But at the same time, this man would open up the church where he was the pastor so that the Black students would have a place to hide. Again, the power of friendship. Friendship can change lives. Friendship can transform circumstances. Friendship can open up the doors of a church on the campus of Ole Miss and tell the student, this is your place for safety. This is what friendship can do. Friendship can turn the lights on every morning for 4 years on the front porch and say, the bus driver won't leave you because he will see the light. Friendship can be a lunch at a table with a person you're not supposed to eat with. You're not supposed to be in their home unless you're there to clean it. Friendship can be a person who sets out to start a school called Yates Center and get the idea of parents working with their friend. Friendship can be Miss Mary Maxey, my first grade teacher, who simply says, little professor, I have a place for you. And friendship can be my great grandparents, who says to me, this home is your home and you're my child. That's the power of friendship. But when friendship loses its way, envy, greed, jealousy, and even massacres can happen. And so can death. And lastly, friendship can be the man who teaches you that you can be an entrepreneur. It doesn't matter where you came from, but it does matter where you're going. And this is the man who, at the height of legal segregation, the height of Jim Crow laws, he taught me about another world I had yet to see, but one that he believed with all of his heart would be waiting for me at some point in my life. And it's from this man in his ice house that I learned how to own a business, to run a business, and to do the things that were necessary in order to make a mark in that world. Yes, I encountered ordinary people who became extraordinary leaders. And that is what happened in the 1900s on Black Wall Street. Ordinary people became extraordinary people, leaving a legacy that will never be forgotten and one that will always be remembered. And 8 Habits of the Heart became the book that surrounded their stories and surrounded their lives, forever being a story of the possibilities of who we are and who we can become. Friendship matters. It is the glue that holds community together, that holds my family and your family and those across town and even people from distant lands. Friendship matters because it can build bridges between people that can literally last all their lives. It's 2021 now, 100 years later. And the questions we ask ourselves as we think about Black Wall Street, we think about the lives lost, we think about the property destroyed, we think about the hurt that will probably never go away. We think about the survivors who lived long enough to leave their stories to us so that we would have a sense of what happened to the world they had built for us. They wanted Black Wall Street to forever stand so that we could actually see the work of their hands, that we could actually feel the spirit of their imagination, that we could actually understand their inquisitive nature and their ability to, the audacity to be no longer enslaved and step out to build your own world, a world that was destroyed in less than 48 hours. But it's now 2021 and 100 years has passed. And we now ask ourselves the incredible question, what are our next steps? Our next steps will always be our children. They are the incredible future leaders. Our children, the innocence, what do we give them? How do we show them friendship? A place and time where all are respected, affirmed, and included, so that these 5 children will grow up to be participants in the world in which they live in, working hand in hand, working together to solve problems, to solve issues, working together to create a world where war is no longer the requirement that we see around the world, but that peace can literally become something that we can hold in our hearts and share with others. Yes, we must show them friendship, a place and time where all are respected, affirmed, and included. And then we can join with Satchmo, Louis Armstrong, who in 1967 penned these incredible, well, he didn't pen the words, but this song became a signature song of his, What a Wonderful World. Reality tells us that the world is not so wonderful today, but that doesn't keep our hearts from looking for that wonderful world, that other place. I believe such a heart and such a mind would have been inside of those of our kin who had been enslaved, having worked the fields of the Delta, the rice fields of South Carolina, the tobacco fields of Virginia, that they would have always dreamed of a wonderful world, a world beyond enslavement. So this is what Satchmo says. What a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbows, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of the people going by. I see friends shaking hands saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They will learn much more than I would never know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, what a wonderful world we can have. Our friendship to make that wonderful world. Mrs. Harrison, thank you for letting me be the closing speaker for this incredible set of programs that Tulsa Central Library has created for all of us, giving us reason to ponder the past, but never ever giving up on the future, and taking the words of Louis Armstrong and just tell ourselves, in spite of what we see, in spite of what has not happened, what a wonderful world we can have. That's our decision to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Taulbert. That was a wonderful presentation. And I have some questions for you, both some questions of my own and questions that we've received from folks in the audience. But I'll start with one of my questions. You're a very powerful writer. I actually have my copy of 8 Habits of the Heart right here. And as you can see, I've bookmarked several pages of excerpts that I found inspiring. You write about Ma Ponk, who's mentioned throughout the book. It took courage to live day by day in a world that had forgotten she was its sister. Her faith and the rituals she practiced somehow gave her the assurance she needed to carry on. Every night for the 12 years that I lived at her house, I saw this aging lady feed her courage with a faith that she passed on to me. So what I would like to know is, can you talk a little bit about what keeps you going when sometimes the racial divide in this country still feels really wide and impossible to breach?
You know, I go back to my childhood, to my young adulthood in the Mississippi Delta, where what we experience today, I'm not sure it was worse or the same, but it was a way of life. But I also encountered ordinary people like my great aunt, who in spite of that travesty, they found a way to love and care. and look forward to a better day. And I would say my faith was part of that because that's the only world I knew. And it allowed me to dream when it seemed as if dreaming would be impossible. It allowed me to imagine a future that seemed absolutely unreasonably unreal, that it could never happen. I literally thought that the cotton fields of the Delta would be the only thing I would know throughout my life. Because my great aunt, she's 70, she's 80, she's 90, almost 100 when she passed away. And she had retired, not from being a nurse, not from being a school teacher, but she had retired from picking cotton. I thought that would be my world, but they did not think it would be my world. And it's to those incredible people of the Mississippi Delta that I owe whatever I have achieved. It's literally, it belongs to all of them.
That's amazing. And thank you for sharing those lessons with everyone else through your book, because I found so many of the lessons that you talk about meaningful and important, and they resonated with me as well. So as far as audience questions goes, we do have one from an anonymous attendee. They would like to know, and you did talk about friendship in this presentation, but they have asked, which habit of the heart is closest to your heart?
The habit of the heart that is probably the closest to me would be nurturing attitude, because it has to do with the unselfish use of time. And that is what we give to other people, people that are kin and people that are friends and people we don't know. And it's so easy to say, I don't have time. But as I tell people quite often, the timekeeper will never give us 2810. All we have is 24/7. And we have to use it as wisely and as unselfishly as we can, because other people matter.
Nurturing attitude. For those of you who are not familiar with the 8 habits, I'm just going to quickly list them so that everybody is aware of which ones we're talking about here today. So nurturing attitude is number 1. Number 2 and 3 are dependability and responsibility. Number 4 is friendship. Number 5 is brotherhood. Number 6 is high expectations. Number 7 is courage. Number 8 is hope. So I do have a question about courage, which is one of the 8 habits of the heart. In the book, you cite a quote, which is, "Courage grows strong at a wound." And I was thinking about that quote and how the Tulsa Race Massacre is kind of like a huge wound at the center of our community. And it affects us today, as Kim mentioned in her introduction. It's something that lingers and will continue to linger because it was such a powerful and damaging event. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that quote, "Courage grows strong in a wound," in regard to Tulsans who want to make a difference in this community. How can we be courageous, and what can we do in our daily life to help maybe start the process of healing that wound?
I think when we think of courage growing stronger at a wound, when we look at the wound and have a clear understanding of what happened, we see part of ourselves there, because we are one great humanity, body of people. Though we are different in so many ways, we are so much the same in the ways that really matter. So when we run into a hurt, when we run into a pain, we run into a wound, however that wound may have come, even though we may be looking down at a person or across at the person, I think we have a sense of our own humanity. We have a sense of our own struggle, our own hurt, our own pain. And I think at that point, courageous actions began to envelop us. And we began to have a clearer understanding of what is required of us. And it gives us the idea, I want to do something. You know, when I wrote the book, it was at a very crucial time in America's history. But I realized to myself, someone has to say that we don't have to do what we've always done. We can do something different. We can do something better. and we can have the courage that is necessary to make those new pathways.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And, to just back up those feelings that we all have about wanting to make Tulsa a better, more inclusive place with friendship at the center, a strong community, just to back all of those feelings up with actions that we do in our daily lives, no matter how small. So that was one of the takeaways that I took from your book.
And that's really it's 8 Habits of the Heart is a book of individual unselfish acts, but it's also is a book of showing you the impact of micro dosages of unselfishness on the life of another person.
Mm-hmm.
As I tell people, we're not asking people to build the Eiffel Tower, it already exists. The Golden Gate Bridge is already there in San Francisco. The pyramids are already in Africa. We don't have to rebuild those. But we still have the opportunity to build bridges between each other. We still have the opportunity to shake hands and hold hearts with each other. And that, to me, are the things that we can do and that we should do. And those are the things that are required of us if we are to leave a world intact for the generations of children not yet born.
100%, yes. And it can get overwhelming. I think, just thinking about how enormous some of the problems in our world seem, it can get overwhelming. But when you drill it down to what you said, these small and selfish acts, knowing that you can make a difference that way is really empowering. So Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, those acts may be small, but it is the consistency of the small acts that really builds the community that we have come to know and the community that we will want to know and to call our own.
Yes. And I know that some of the smallest kindnesses that I've experienced in my life are the ones that made the biggest impact on me and that I remember and still think about now. So if anyone is doubting the impact of small, unselfish acts, I think they're so important. Let's turn back to the audience questions because I'm getting quite a few. And in addition to questions, lots of comments thanking you and mentioning how much they enjoyed your talk. So this question says, thank you for the beautiful stories of courageous men, women, and children. Tulsa continues to be a very segregated community, sadly including our places of worship. We must be intentional about forging friendships. What are examples of this happening today in Tulsa? So I think they mean examples of friendships in Tulsa.
It's really interesting. Something happened to me on January the 7th, the day after January the 6th, a day that will probably live in infamy for the rest of my life. I was in the Tulsa post office. I was the only person there, was mailing off, shipping coffee by myself. An older white gentleman walked in. He looked rather disheveled. And for some reason, I was still in the mindset of January the 6th. So I moved away from the door. I got to the other side of the table, so there would be no connection at all. I just didn't want to be involved in anything that even looked like January the 6th. And so the gentleman said, well, what do you have there? And I sheepishly said, it's just coffee, because I was trying to make the conversation as succinct and as quickly as possible. And he kept talking and I kept talking. And I'm beginning to understand as we keep talking and we keep talking, then all of a sudden it wasn't fear, it was caution. It was an over amount of caution that I had to get in and out, because the doors to the post office didn't open until 8:30 and we were around 8:25. So I had about 5 minutes there. But long story short, as we talked among ourselves, and then we began to laugh, and I realized that he knew people that I knew, and I knew people that he knew. And all of a sudden, it wasn't the black guy and the white guy, both about the same age in the post office. But as the door opened, he held the door for me. to get in with the coffee that I had. And we have had 2 breakfasts since that time. So how do you, and come to find out, he wasn't a disheveled man that was looking to start a rumble. He was a retired neurosurgeon.
Wow, that's amazing.
And we had breakfast a couple of days ago.
Wow.
So what do? You have to be intentional, and sometimes you have to take a chance. But I think friendship is worth taking a chance. Not just for me, but for our children and our children's children. We want them to see, as Satchmo said, a wonderful world. And we're the only ones who can make it a wonderful world.
That is beautiful and amazing, and goes to show that we can form connections with other people, even in the most mundane places.
Yes.
Okay, another audience question from Melinda. I would love to know your thoughts on the Black Lives Matter movement of today.
I grew up in the Mississippi Delta. And you have to know not only what happened, but the psychological world that I grew up in, whereby fear that had evolved during the time of enslavement had also made its way into the sharecropper world that was the world that I grew up in, the world of picking and chopping cotton. And we would hear quite often about men and women who had been shot or died without any thought at all. And even though it was years ago, more than 50 or 60 years ago, I still remember the church bell toning at night because someone had gotten killed. Someone had stepped into an area that was all white and was killed or something like that. And I think that it evolves out of the idea that when someone dies that you care about, you want to run there and hold them as if you can hold life back into them. But when someone dies and they're just kicked to the curb as if their humanity didn't matter. People were still being hung when I was a child. So the story is not about the death as much as it is about the life that death took away, that Black lives matter. We are not the throwaways. We are your sisters and your brothers, period.
I think that's very true and very beautiful. Let's see. We have a question from a parent. How can I model the principles of your book for my 2-year-old daughter?
How old is the daughter?
2.
2. Well, I can say that 2 is pretty good time to start showing your daughter the world that you want her to help build. And we have to be intentional about that. I know when my son was younger, he would always invite people over for dinner or something. And they said, well, don't you have to call your parents? They said, no, they always have food for other people. Yeah, you just have to do right consistently. And sometimes you have to take a chance because our division has been so ingrained in the culture that it really takes taking a chance and being very intentional about stepping out of the comfort zones that have been built for generations by both races. And we know where we feel comfortable and we know where we don't feel comfortable. But as I was saying in a speech I'd given maybe a week ago, I was in Alabama, a Zoom speech, but many of the people had to get off Zoom because of the tornadoes that were happening in the town at the time. And I said, it's this moment in time when the tree falls on your house and your family is caught there. You don't really care who comes and help you pull the tree off the house so that you can save your family. I said, this is the way we have to be all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Understanding and embracing what we all share, humanity, which is a gift from someone bigger than all of us.
And I think that at 2, you know, a child is watching all of these things. They're watching the behavior of their parents and how they treat other people. I don't have kids, but I have a niece, and it is shocking how perceptive little kids are and how aware they are of what's going on around them. So
Oh yeah.
I don't think there's an age that's too early to start modeling good principles.
And the modeling is good for us because it is so easy to fall off the wagon of humanity as it is to stay on. So when we take on the role of modeling for others, we're reinforcing our own values as well.
Yes. They're your little accountability partners. They'll also point out if you do something that is not in line with what they think you should be doing. So yeah, kids are great. Okay, so I am a librarian, so I feel like I have to ask if you have any books that you would recommend for people who were inspired by your books.
Books that I would recommend. Let me see. You know, most books, when I write about Black life and Southern life, I don't read as many of those books as I'd like to, for the simple reason the life is so much the same until you can read something and 6 months later you have an idea that you think is yours and it really came off page 67 in somebody else's book. So I try not to put myself in that set of circumstances. So the books that I read are more along the lines of entrepreneurship. I love the life of Leonardo da Vinci and Steve Jobs, not because of what they accomplished, but because they didn't have any secret sauce. I finally figured out what they brought to the table. I have those same gifts. The only difference is I didn't give myself the opportunity to embrace inquisitiveness as an asset or to accelerate my imagination as an asset either. Now that I'm beginning to understand that I can do that, that will impact how I do my life as I move forward. So entrepreneurial books are the books that I mostly read, and I love Southern life, but I try to stay I try to stay away from it if it's any way close to what I'm thinking about writing, so that I don't get caught in having picked up an idea from someone else. And I love the books that have been written about Greenwood. They've just been so revealing. I've done about 25 years of research on Black Wall Street, but I have about 4 manuscripts that I just didn't take the time to get them published.
Wow.
But at some point, I think I will.
Wow. Well, you're wildly productive. I mean, you've already written so many books, and it sounds like you have other manuscripts just waiting in the wings.
Just waiting in the wings.
That's awesome. So it sounds like you read to be inspired by other people and their experiences.
I love biographies. I just love the life of other people, because when you read the life of other people, it's almost like you're reading pages left out of your life. And you get a broader sense of humanity and where you fit and how you can even fit closer or better. I mean, Emily Dickinson was absolutely right in what she said. There is no frigate like a book.
Absolutely. You're preaching to the choir here. I think books change lives like nobody's business. So
they're wonderful.
Yes, absolutely. I could tell by reading your book that you must also be a reader, because your turns of phrase are so wonderful and eloquent. Let's see. Another audience question we have here. With the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th and 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act, The Black race have a sense of hope that things would change, yet so many years later, we are still mired in race issues. How do you propose to keep the momentum moving forward after this 100-year anniversary is in the rearview mirror?
That's a good question, because at some point it will be the day after. And that is what we have to think about. How do we move forward? How do we take the lessons that we have learned and implement those lessons? And that to me is the intentionality of it. I don't want the world to remain the same. I want it to be the better world that it can be. So that requires intentionality on my part. And again, there's a habit that says courage is basically doing what is right, even if you have no one backing you. Sometimes we have to have the courage to continue those right acts, even when no one is following suit with us. It's so much better to be if the band is playing, but oftentimes the band won't be playing when we're doing the right thing. So I think that all of us, myself included, we have to think what's going to happen on June 2nd, 2021. We'll celebrate June 1st because that's the great tragic day. But June 2nd is not a holiday. It's not a celebratory day. It's a day that is left for us to make decisions. What will we do going forward? So the question that was asked was absolutely right. At the end of the day, I have to figure out how to care about my brothers and my sisters who don't look like me and how to love those who look like me. Just caring about people. I mean, that's the great job we have. And it requires intentionality on all of our parts to step out of that fear zone. And just as I did at the library that day, and realize that I made a friend that'll probably last a lifetime.
And I think, the book is called 8 Habits of the Heart. And in a way, I think that, the intentionality that you're talking about, the commitment, to extending friendship to those around you and doing unselfish acts actually is a habit. It's something that you can build up over time by repetition. And the momentum then comes because suddenly this is just part of who you are, and this is part of how you live your life. And so if you make it a priority, then it will become a habit. And so that's something that I've been thinking about, keeping that at the forefront of my mind so that it becomes second nature to always do those things.
And I would think the memory of the people who lost their lives on Black Wall Street, they deserve our best walk
100%.
to memorize, because, when I read the stories, and I had a lot of time to interview some of the survivors and talk with them, they're the ones, they were the ones whose community basically died. And they obviously, they did some things to bring it back to life. But that first Black Wall Street, that was their heart and soul. That to me was an incredible, daring journey to have accomplished what they did and to see it all destroyed. But at the same time, they went back into restoration mode in such a way that was just absolutely amazing. And I think this is what they would want for us. Mm-hmm. They dreamed the best dreams that they could dream at the time. Oklahoma was totally segregated by that time. Jim Crow laws were enforced by that time. But yet and still, they had this seemingly unquenchable appetite to call us to be the best of who we could be, even in the worst of times.
Incredibly, incredibly inspiring and motivating, to think about those people who lost everything. And that's another huge motivator and inspiration for those of us who are wanting to continue the fervor and the zeal to make Tulsa a better place beyond the 100-year anniversary and forever. Um, let's see. So you spoke at the library staff development day last year. That was incredibly inspiring. And so many people on staff made comments about how it's the best part of the day. And everyone here tonight has seen what a wonderful speaker you are and how powerful and inspiring you are. I'm just wondering if anything has happened in your life recently that inspired you.
I would say nothing has happened recently that inspires me, but I realize that life is a gift. My wife and I and our son, we lost our daughter and her sister when she was 7, and I think that loss has helped me to understand how thankful I should be for life and try to make the best out of life that I possibly can. My daughter, when she was first grade, I would always go to Jinx and read to her. And she would sit on my knee while I was reading to her class. And she would tell the class, it's so wonderful to have an author in the house. I don't know where she got that from. I have no idea where Annie got that from, but that's what she would always say. And I think the memory of her life and the legacy of her life inspires me to look for the best. You don't ignore the worst. You don't ignore what's bad, but you never keep your heart from reaching for the best.
Wow. Well, I'm very sorry for your loss, but it sounds like she made a huge impact.
Oh, she's yeah, she did, and she does.
That's wonderful. Wow. Okay, let's see. We do have a couple more audience questions that I'll try to get to here. Someone wants to know what brought you to Tulsa, and did you know about the race massacre when you came here?
I was in the military, in the Air Force for 4 years, worked in the 89th Presidential Wing in Washington, D.C. And after being discharged, I had about 2 years of college left. And I came out to Oral Roberts University and I completed my undergraduate work there. I had never heard of Black Wall Street ever. And I was a voracious reader. Even in the military, I was writing. That's where I started writing, was in the military, carrying a brown pasteboard box with all of my notes in it. Didn't have a laptop at those days, didn't have a iPhone, anything like that. I had yellow pads, but I'd never heard of Black Wall Street. But after graduating from ORU, I decided not to go back to Washington to graduate school. I stayed here and I became involved in the city, was on the advisory board for Gilcrease Museum. And on the advisory board was a Black lady by the name of Opal Dorgan, who was a retired Black school teacher here in the Tulsa area. And she was a little girl during the 1921 race massacre. And it was she who first told me the story. And I will always remember that even though she was an older lady, grown, completely an adult, but as she began to tell me the story, she became like 6 years old again. I mean, it was just as real to her as happening as if it had happened right then. Back then, it was probably about 80 years, 75 or 80 years ago for her then. But to tell the story, it was just like it had just happened the day before.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I imagine when it's a trauma that is that intense and life-shattering, that it would be easy to revert back into that mindset of when it happened.
It's almost like the countries that we watch on television that have been devastated by war to a great extent. And the people who leave those places, their conversations are not unlike the survivors of the 1921 race massacre. Because the tragic was in the losing, but you lost a part of who you were, and your heart and soul that you had brought to the table was dismembered in front of you to some degree. So it had a a multiplicity of ways in which it could negatively impact the people who were there at the time that it actually happened.
Yeah. I'm sure she was an incredibly strong person. I mean, anyone who withstood that and went on to live a long life must
Yeah,
have
and
been
even,
incredibly strong.
and she was such a volunteer in the city of Tulsa. I mean, at the Mount Vernon AME Church, where she was a member, she had after school programs and she had summer programs, and she would always get me involved. I had to go over there and teach kids and stuff. I mean, you were not allowed to be idle in the mind of Mrs. Dorgan. There was always something to do and something to be, and so I will be forever grateful to her for mentoring me in the way of civic responsibility.
That's amazing.
Because if anyone could have had a good reason for not being civically involved, she most certainly could have.
Yeah. Wow. That's incredibly inspiring. And I'm glad that you encountered her and you were able to be mentored by her. Sounds amazing. Okay, we have one more question here from the audience. Some praise for you. Clifton Taulbert is such a bright star, smart, kind, courageous. What is his sage advice that pops in his mind that the rest of us can do or keep in mind to better our community? And then they say in a parenthetical, yes, I've read several of his books.
Good. Well, I think, Mrs. Harrison, you've said it, not because I wrote the book. I was fortunate enough to have written 8 Habits of the Heart. Former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor read the book, and she called my office. And the gentleman who worked with me at the time answered the phone. He said, "The joke of the year is on the phone. She says she's Sandra Day O'Connor, and we know better. Do you want me to hang up, or do you want to talk?" It was Sandra Day O'Connor. And I did go to Washington, my wife and several friends from Tulsa, and address members of the United States Supreme Court and 150 of their guests. 8 Habits of the Heart is probably one of the most transformative books I've ever written. John Wooden sent a letter to the CEO of the Williams companies, who had apparently played basketball for him at some point in time. And he said, "I just read a book, 8 Habits of the Heart, and I couldn't put it down until I had read the very last page. Everyone needs to read this book." And it has a life of its own. If you read the book, it demands action, unselfish action on our part. And once you read it, it's sort of like the cousin who comes to stay and won't leave. It just hangs on you, and you have to end up doing something in order to get peace from the book. That is what I recommend to people to do, is to read 8 Habits of the Heart, not as a book, but as a manual for life. Read a chapter, maybe one chapter, and then figure out, how do I become this habit of the heart? What do I have to do? Because if we were all doing that and all becoming that, then our city will become transformed in a way that is beyond imagination.
I agree 100% with that. And I will add that each chapter about each habit has questions for reflection at the end. And I think this book would be perfect for families to read together and talk about it together. This is something that, it demands action, but I also think it demands discussion with people you care about, to talk about the habits and how you can be accountability buddies. I'm big on this accountability buddy idea for each other, and making sure that you're upholding the things that are included in this book. And I just think there's so much to discuss here. So it's a short book, but it's so full and rich. So I will just echo what Mr. Taulbert said. We have so many copies in the collection, so please put a copy on hold and read it. It will change your life.
Well, thank you, and thank the audience for allowing me to talk.
It was a pleasure.
These these stories and just the library is becoming such a center point for a community and to be involved in remembering Black Wall Street, but at the same time calling us for action, positive action going forward, not just for one group of people, but for all of us, so that our children can see that picture. And so they will know that's the picture, that's the way it should be. And as Louis Armstrong says, what a wonderful world it can be, but that's the decision that we have to make.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Taulbert, and thank you to everyone in the audience for attending tonight. As I mentioned, copies of Mr. Taulbert's books are available for checkout through our website or for purchase from our partner, Fulton Street Books and Coffee. Please visit the library's website, tulsalibrary.org, or call the library to find out more about TCCL Remembers exhibit that Ms. Johnson mentioned in her introduction. And I hope everyone has a wonderful evening, and thank you again, Mr. Taulbert.
Thank all of you for the invitation as well.